In the summer of 1962, 26 high-yield airdrops, proof tests of new and existing weapon designs, were conducted by the United States. In this, the last of the above-ground nuclear tests, the Atomic Energy Commission also tested advanced concepts for an anti-ballistic missile defense. Starfish Prime was one of 5 high-altitude ABM tests.
And in that event, we learned something about the effects on our satellites. We learned about the effects on aircraft that we had operating at the time, and even at the events on Hawaii.
Nearly 1,000 miles away, the high-altitude electromagnetic pulse from Starfish Prime disrupted Hawaii's power grid and its telecommunications.
The Starfish test gave us a much better appreciation for the extent to which EMP environments could propagate.
The effects outside of the Earth's atmosphere were especially significant. The communication relay circuitry of Telstar-1, the prize of the satellite community, was an inadvertent casualty of the 1.4 megaton test. The effects of Starfish Prime also underscored known vulnerabilities of U.S. ballistic missile systems. By 1962, efforts were underway to ensure the never of nuclear weapons with PALs and safety retrofits. Ensuring the always, the nuclear weapon affects survivability of warheads, now commanded equal attention. The earliest re-entry systems had not been sufficiently hardened against nuclear environments.
So hardness was one of the big deals in Minuteman II. We wanted the missile to be rad hard, starting from the re-entry vehicle down through the propulsion, including all the guidance electronics. Rad hard, big deal. We spent a lot of money on that.
May Day celebration in Moscow's Red Square, and the traditional parade features military equipment.
When Galosh was revealed, it came as a shock, because we, by that time, realized we'd made fundamental error in the assumptions for the possibility of a ballistic missile defense on the part of the Soviets. When we got the technical intelligence that said that the Soviets had proceeded down a different path altogether, we were forced to deal with exoatmospheric effects.
The Galosh really put the stake in the ground for pursuing hardness for all weapons in the future.
The predominant vulnerability from a weapons survivability perspective varies depending upon whether you're looking at it exoatmospherically or endoatmospherically. Outside the atmosphere, X-rays will travel great distances because they're unattenuated by the vacuum of space.
Be it the aeroshell, or the nuclear package, or the arming, fusing, and firing system. All portions of a reentry body are potentially vulnerable.
In particular, the electronics had to be treated in such a way that it could survive rather heavy nuclear doses, and that meant not only making designs, but testing them.
Underground testing in tunnels deep beneath the surface provides information about nuclear effects that cannot be obtained in any other way. Here in steel pipes, as much as 1/4 of a mile long, specially tailored experiments yield up information that is vital to the design of new weapon systems. Quick closing shutters stop the debris from blowing down the pipe and wrecking the experiments, but permit X-rays and particles to reach their targets.
As the Atomic Energy Commission began to address nuclear weapon effects survivability, the Department of Defense considered the strategic impact of a broad-based Soviet ballistic missile defense.
We assumed that they wouldn't just defend Moscow, they would extend it across all of Russia, all of the Soviet Union. And we had to think about how would we respond to that.
How do we insulate ourselves against an expansion of the defense? an active nuclear tip defense. What do we do on the offensive side to assure penetration?
There are two generically different ways of going about it. One of them was to penetrate by using penetration aids, which in effect denies the information needed to discriminate reentry bodies from decoys. And that was the approach that was taken largely by the Air Force.
And we'd done all kinds of experiments on decoys, balloons, chaff, you name it. Always come to the conclusion finally that, look, by the time you get down through the atmosphere, these things don't work very well.
This year, more fleet ballistic missile submarines increase our nuclear deterrent powers on the 7 seas. Each is ready to fire Polaris missiles from hidden launching platforms.
We spent a lot of time and energy on penetration aids, particularly with Polaris, the so-called A3T, which had substantial penetration aid capability. But it also meant that we concluded that the best penetration aid is another warhead, and that led to Poseidon.
A second approach to the problem of survivability was one advocated by Vice Admiral Levering Smith, the longtime director of the Navy's Special Projects Office.
The quote of Levering Smith's is that we'll make decoys, only we'll put a bomb in each one of them. In other words, the Poseidon was a vast expansion of the number of reentry bodies carried per missile. And basically the idea was to overload the defense with so many reentry bodies that they were incapable of handling all of them at the same time.
MIRVs that could substantially increase our offensive capability was one way of doing it.
In 1964, McNamara approved the development of multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles. MIRVs fulfilled a policy objective and offered the Navy new capabilities.
You know, there's a real difference in ballistic missile systems between Air Force systems and Navy systems. The real difference is the Navy is very size, weight constrained.
Small is important in the sense that because of the submarine limitations, the Navy can't capriciously decide they want to have bigger missiles. Weight is always a concern to the Navy as it translates into throw range, which then converts into patrol area.
In Poseidon, the desire was to get the smallest possible reentry body so we could put the largest number of them on the front end of this new Poseidon missile.
And so it was an absolutely unique undertaking, and one upon which the performance of the Navy systems absolutely depended.
Looking like a stub-wing pursuit ship, the Regulus churns up the water as it is blasted off the cruiser Helena.
Like the other services, the Navy actively pursued a nuclear capability early on. In 1955, the Fleet Ballistic Missile was conceived of as a complete system, put in place and maintained by the Navy's Special Projects Office. Polaris was on station by 1960. Guided first by Admiral Red Rayburn, the Navy's SPO would, through the practice of integration, deploy Poseidon in 1971.
We could not afford carrying 1 extra pound of weight. We deliberately designed and wrote specifications for not the fusing system, not for an arming system or a warhead. We wrote our requirements for a reentry body, which was an integrated system.
The notion of integration allows you to better manage packaging, mounting, and interfaces between two different assemblies. I believe integration bought for the Navy the ability to do the Mark III system.
The traditional arming, fusing, and firing systems were sufficiently large that they had to be packaged in the back end of the reentry vehicle. As a result, a ballast had to be added in to offset the weight of this active hardware in the back of the body. If the arming, infusing, and firing system could be miniaturized and integrated such that it could be packaged in what was otherwise ballast space in the front, then you could save much more than pound for pound in the design of the reentry body.
To do that, we needed some new thinking about the arming and the fusing.
Sandia and Lawrence and Los Alamos were in fact building reentry vehicles that would support the feasibility of small multiples.
Ironically, the semiconductors so essential to small multiples opened the door to increased radiation effects. Miniaturization both required and enabled the developer to consider a wider range of design options.
Through integration, if I've been able to save weight, I can now think about utilizing some of that weight margin for features that would allow me to enhance the radiation hardness of the design.
So it's a matter of choosing the right elemental components. It's a matter of the proper circuit design.
It meant that the nuclear materials, making sure that if they got to very high temperature, it wouldn't distort.
They wanted to carry as many as 14 reentry bodies. Weight was extremely important to their achieving that number of bodies for the range they wanted. So ounces counted.
There was no free lunch in the design of the Mark III reentry body, its warhead, or its arming, fusing, and firing system.
Sandia, together with its AEC partners, met the challenges and delivered a highly reliable, lightweight, radiation-hardened design fulfilling the Navy's objective of a survivable nuclear deterrent.
The decision that we made for the Mark III to use Sandia, it was something quite new. We didn't know how it was going to work out. It turned out to work out very well indeed.
Probably the two key thrusts that were enablers for the future were miniaturization and hardness. Those two together allowed us to meet sort of evolving stockpile needs for much harder from a radiation perspective, smaller, lighter reentry systems for the stockpile.
In May 1972, anti-ballistic missile system development was checked by a landmark arms control agreement. Even as Nixon and Brezhnev signed the ABM treaty, new threats were emerging to challenge the survivability of the U.S. strategic deterrent.
Right after the Moscow summit, I was still Director of Central Intelligence. There was a veritable explosion of research and development activities on the part of the Russians. The number of tests of Soviet missiles just expanded exponentially.
The ICBMs, or the strategic offensive missiles that are deployed in the 1970s, carry multiple warheads, and they are more accurate, and therefore they do pose a greater threat to hardened targets in the U.S.
In 1972, the Soviets deployed their first Delta-class ballistic missile submarine with a missile range of more than 4,000 miles.
Late 60s, we became increasingly concerned about potential anti-submarine warfare capabilities of the Soviets.
It was believed by many that it was only a matter of time until a counter to the submarine was found. The oceans were going to be made transparent. That led to a whole bunch of discussions and debates about survivability.
For the Navy, survivability meant both penetrating Soviet defenses as well as shielding its sea-based platforms from detection. To enhance what the Navy called its pre-launch survivability, the Poseidon submarines could no longer cruise close to shore.
from a survivability of the launch platform. The larger the area you patrol in, the harder it is to detect where you're located.
So going from the C3 Poseidon to the C4 Trident, we gained a tremendous increase in sea room.
And also, in order to keep the missile as effective at the greater range, we had to have some improvement in the accuracy.
A highly integrative effort by the Navy and Sandia led to the Mark IV, a smaller, lighter-weight, rad-hardened reentry body, which would become the most numerous of any nuclear weapon type deployed. And the C4 missile would achieve a throw weight comparable to that of the Air Force's Minuteman III. But the Navy's nuclear mission remained unchanged, driven largely by the limitations of accuracy.
The system served the same purposes as on the Poseidon.
To destroy urban industrial targets through defenses.
So the development of longer-range systems, in fact, becomes an enabler for much greater flexibility in terms of patrol area, greater flexibility in terms of target coverage.
So you combine the greater sea room with greater accuracy, and you have a more capable system to target the enemy.
As Trident I was ready to fulfill the Navy's nuclear mission, national policy was evolving in a new direction, different from that served by sea-based forces directed at large urban industrial targets. A nuclear targeting policy review, prepared for the Carter administration, warned of the construction of deep underground shelters in the Moscow area.
Evidence that the Soviet Union was planning to try to survive a nuclear war, ride out a nuclear war, with hardened bunkers for the command, with the deployment of the new systems with hard target kill capability. All of this pointed to a very worrying kind of image.
The Soviets continue to develop and deploy strategic offensive nuclear forces.
Part of the Reagan campaign was to convince the Congress that this is what's going on. We never took that seriously. You couldn't. But what we did conclude is that at least psychologically, it was not acceptable to continue when the Soviets had this huge SS-18 with 10 warheads, and the best we could do was a Minuteman with 3 warheads.
Right at that time, we believed that the Russians were achieving an ability to take out, with very high yield, very high precision warheads, missiles and warheads, to be able to take out our ICBM force.
Accuracies are being achieved on ICBMs. That meant that ICBMs were losing some of their credibility as a highly survivable basing.
And we were going through the throes of a national, almost a crisis within the Department of Defense on how we were going to make that force survivable.
We said we have to deploy the MX, or Peacekeeper. And the first thing we'll do is just put it in silos. And then we will look for alternative deployments. But that is not a stabilizing system. We're putting that in because we do have to repair parity between the forces.
We needed to develop and deploy weapon systems based upon considerations of what the other side would be prepared to do. You cannot simply say we will deter without being able to execute in wartime.
We then had a significant breakthrough with the deployment of the Trident II missile. Because Trident II missile had both throw weight and accuracy.
What we did with D5, Mark V, was to create a peacekeeper-like capability as part of the seaborne strategic deterrent.
The W-88 Mark V system, what it provides is a significant increase in accuracy, and that's resulted from the D5 missile and also from the integrated arming, fusing, and firing system that Sandy and the Navy worked together to develop.
It became capable of engaging essentially any interesting target. So with the high-yield W-88 warhead, the Trident II forced the Navy into thinking beyond the notions of counter value.
Rather than a deterrent which was mainly based on large area targets, we could focus more on striking the military capability.
On balance, it was decided to go with a higher yield system to be able to hold at risk those targets in the Soviet Union that were of very high concern to us.
And so the maneuverability of quiet submarines was a guarantee, really a very high quality guarantee of a survivable system that couldn't be targeted.
In the mid-1980s, nuclear deterrence was best served by the strategically stable and survivable Trident II D5 missile system, the development of which would prompt design decisions at the nexus of always and never.
There was the tension between getting a high yield in the W-88 because of a concern for being able to hold at risk very hard targets in the Soviet Union. Tension between that and the use of insensitive high explosive.
Explosives used in the weapon's primary that were less detonable in an accident. During the late 1960s, nuclear weapon accidents over Spain and Greenland raised international concerns about the dispersal of plutonium resulting from detonation of the bomb's high explosive. By 1970, weapon designers began to revisit what had been an old idea of developing an explosive for use in nuclear weapons that was less sensitive. But insensitive high explosive would come with design costs, added weight, and greater volume.
At the labs, it became a principal theme of weapon design during the late 70s and early 80s. When I moved to the Pentagon in 1981, I took it as a little crusade on my part to embed in the practices, regulations, thinking of the Pentagon, the importance of IHE.
During Mark V development, there was a consideration, designs around conventional HE and those involving insensitive HE. The designs at the time identified significant packaging impact.
We had a very unique missile system in which a third stage extended up through the post-boost vehicle deck, and the way we deployed warheads was in a fairly narrow annular ring around that third stage. During the Cold War, we wanted to get the maximum yield in the minimum size and weight package.
We couldn't have gotten the capability that was needed for the mission out of the Mark V unless we went with CHE, conventional high explosive.
The use of conventional high explosive, requiring less volume, would enable a lighter, high-yield reentry body, with a base diameter conforming to the space available on the D5's through-deck configuration.
Conventional HE was insensitive enough to meet their standards for nuclear safety and to allow them also to meet their operational goals within an optimized design.
I decided that reliability of the design outweighed the need for IHE. I also required the Navy to do a very extensive study of the handling of nuclear weapons in their custody.
We basically went through the strategic weapons facilities with a fine-tooth comb to look at every phase of how the weapon was handled and looked at what could we do to improve the environment. And I believe it was the thoroughness of that safety study that was the final deciding factor.
Rapid development and testing of Trident II followed, the pace of which rivaled its predecessors, Poseidon and Polaris. By late 1989, the Trident II missile system was nearing its initial operational capability. At the same time, dramatic political changes were unfolding in Europe with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the prelude to German reunification, and the unilateral withdrawal of Soviet forces from Eastern Europe, and a U.S.-Soviet summit yielding agreement on bilateral reductions in conventional forces. These events would spawn major unilateral reductions in U.S. nuclear forces, beginning with the de-alerting of the Strategic Bomber Force. In this time frame, the safety of several U.S. nuclear weapon systems came under congressional scrutiny.
Professor Sid Drell, he and Johnny Foster co-chaired a review committee on safety and security of nuclear weapons, IHE, and with some focus on the W-88.
We ended up focusing on the probability that if the missile fell over, would the propellant stage that maneuvered the reentry vehicles, would that deflagrate, maybe even lead to a detonation?
An accident where the missile flops down, we didn't see that they had met the 1-point safety criterion with confidence, based upon the analysis they had done then.
And so then, since these concerns were raised, they tasked the Navy to do a study and to report back to the Drell panel. And they looked at the design of the missile, design of the warhead, and logistics and handling operations.
And we proved the experimental and calculational pedigree of our estimates of missile safety.
And to make a long story short, chatting with the folks from Sandia, they had performed the calculations, and those hydrodynamic calculations satisfied the experimental data.
The added safety you bought by using insensitive high explosive, still with detonable propellant, was seen to be minimal.
I had an opportunity to brief Drell and Townsend and others down at Swift Land, and I believe their conclusions well after the study that it was a lot safer than they had anticipated in the beginning.
Safe, secure, and reliable. And that was job one, and we weren't going to waver from that.
There's always a balance between the surety and safety features and the usability of the weapon. You can make the weapon so safe and so secure that you would have trouble using it in wartime if you had to.
So the question is, in order to assure against, or never, are you willing to sacrifice always? It's always a trade-off.
More than 20 years have passed since the military requirements, the always and the never of a nuclear weapons system, were deliberated upon in response to an emerging threat environment. The world continues to change. We are living in a new threat environment, one that now includes terrorists with nuclear ambitions.
The context for national security changed after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks further altered our perception of the threat. And our nation's national security strategy is evolving to respond to new challenges. For more than 65 years, the U.S. nuclear security enterprise has met the nation's defense priorities. From the urgencies of a world at war in 1945 to the imperatives of the Cold War that followed. From the beginning, nuclear readiness and use control were of paramount importance. After a string of airborne accidents, nuclear safety increased in priority. And later, when U.S.-Soviet relations descended to their lowest point, new nuclear offensive capabilities were deployed. Throughout this history, the men and women of the Department of Energy and its national laboratories, Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore, and Sandia, along with the Department of Defense, have assured the safety, security, and effectiveness of U.S. nuclear weapons. This is a proud legacy and an ongoing endeavor to which all remain committed, maintaining an appropriate balance of always and never to sustain a credible nuclear deterrent.
Anti-ballistic missile defense. Starfish Prime was one of 5 high-altitude ABM tests.
And in that event, we learned something about the effects on our satellites. We learned about the effects on aircraft that we had operating at the time, and even at the events on Hawaii.
Nearly 1,000 miles away, the high-altitude electromagnetic pulse from Starfish Prime disrupted Hawaii's power grid and its telecommunications.
The Starfish test gave us a much better appreciation for the extent to which EMP environments could propagate.
The effects outside of the Earth's atmosphere were especially significant. The communication relay circuitry of Telstar 1, the prize of the satellite community, was an inadvertent casualty of the 1.4 megaton test. The effects of Starfish Prime also underscored known vulnerabilities of U.S. ballistic missile systems. By 1962, efforts were underway to ensure the never of nuclear weapons with PALs and safety retrofits. Ensuring the always, the nuclear weapon affects survivability of warheads, now commanded equal attention.
For the possibility of a ballistic missile defense on the part of the Soviets. When we got the technical intelligence that said that the Soviets had proceeded down a different path altogether, we were forced to deal with exoatmospheric effects.
The galosh really put the stake in the ground for pursuing hardness for all weapons in the future.
The predominant vulnerability from a weapons survivability perspective varies depending upon whether you're looking at it exoatmospherically or endoatmospherically. Outside the atmosphere, X-rays will travel great distances because they're unattenuated.
The earliest re-entry systems had not been sufficiently hardened against nuclear environments.
So hardness was one of the big deals in Minuteman II. We wanted the missile to be rad hard, starting from the re-entry vehicle down through the propulsion, including all the guidance electronics. Rad hard, big deal. We spent a lot of money on that.
May Day celebration in Moscow's Red Square, and the traditional parade features military equipment.
When Galosh was revealed, it came as a shock, because we, by that time, realized we'd made fundamental error in the assumptions.
In the summer of 1962, 26 high-yield airdrops, proof tests of new and existing weapon designs, were conducted by the United States. In this, the last of the above-ground nuclear tests, the Atomic Energy Commission also tested advanced concepts